My name is Phoebe, and I'm 62 years old. Last Christmas, my husband divorced me at the dinner table while his family laughed like it was a joke. I thought that was the worst moment of my life, until a few minutes later when something small and quiet shifted everything. I'll tell you how. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about family drama, quiet revenge, and emotional courage. The table was already set when I realized something felt wrong. Not dramatic wrong, just off. The plates were laid out with that red and green trim my mother-in-law used every December, the one she said made the food feel festive. The turkey sat in the center, steam rising, skin brown just enough to show she checked it 10 times. Everyone was seated except my husband, Mark. That should have been my first clue. Mark never missed his seat, not once in 27 years of marriage. He liked control. He liked timing. I remember smoothing my sweater over my stomach, the soft gray one I wore when I wanted to disappear into the background. Christmas sweaters had always made me feel like I was trying too hard. This one felt safe. Ordinary. That night, ordinary was all I wanted. Around the table were the same faces I'd seen every holiday since I was 35. His parents, his sister, Elaine, and her husband, 2 grown nieces scrolling on their phones. Familiar people, familiar smiles, and yet not one of them looked at me the way they used to. It was like I'd already left the room. Mark finally came in holding his wine glass, not a plate. He didn't sit. He cleared his throat instead. That sound cut through the soft Christmas music playing from the kitchen radio. I knew that sound. It was the sound he made before correcting me in public, before telling a story that made me look foolish. My hands tightened in my lap before I even knew why. "I think now's a good time," he said. No one asked him what he meant. That was the second clue. They were ready. Every last one of them. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, like he was announcing the weather. "After the holidays." Phoebe and I talked. "We're done." We did not talk. Not about this. Not ever. The room went quiet for half a second. Then Elaine laughed. Not a surprised laugh. Not nervous. She laughed like she'd just heard a punchline she'd been waiting for. "Well," she said, glancing at her mother, "about time." His mother shook her head, smiling into her napkin. "I didn't think you'd do it on Christmas," she said, like she was impressed. I felt something leave my body then. Not my heart. Not yet. It was dignity. Or maybe illusion. Something I'd carried for years without realizing how heavy it was. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Mark finally sat down, across from me, folding his napkin neatly. He still wouldn't look at me. "She's taking it well," he added, nodding toward me. I knew she would. That's when the laughter really started. Not loud, controlled, polite, like people laughing at a show they didn't pay for. I looked from face to face, searching for one person who looked uncomfortable, one person who might say, "This isn't the time." There was no one, not even his father, who used to bring me coffee on cold mornings and ask about my garden. The turkey smelled suddenly too strong. My throat tightened. I pressed my feet flat against the floor to remind myself I was still there, still real. I thought of all the Christmases before this one. The years I woke up early to wrap gifts so everyone else could sleep. The times I drove through snow to make sure we didn't show up empty-handed. The quiet compromises I made because that's what long marriages required. None of that mattered now. None of it earned me even a warning. "Did you hear me, Phoebe?" Mark asked. I nodded because it was easier than speaking. Because if I spoke, I might cry, and I wasn't going to give them that. Crying would have been entertainment. I'd already given them enough. Elaine leaned forward. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked. I mean, you don't really work anymore, right? Her words slid into the open space Mark had created. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I had worked, just not in ways they respected. I opened my mouth again, but Mark answered for me. She'll figure it out, he said. She always does. Or she'll have to. Another round of soft laughter. His mother dabbed her eyes, still smiling. Well, she said, at least this clears things up. Christmas miracles do happen. I stared at my plate. The potatoes were untouched. I realized then that no one had asked me how I felt. No one had said they were sorry. It hadn't occurred to them that I might deserve that. To them, this wasn't a loss. It was a correction. The waitress passed by then, refilling water glasses. She smiled at me just briefly. A real smile. It startled me more than the divorce announcement. I nodded back, grateful for the smallest kindness. When she moved on, the table filled again with talk, logistics, jokes, stories from past holidays. I wasn't part of any of them. I'd become background noise in my own marriage. Mark leaned back in his chair, relaxed now. We'll get through tonight, he said to the table, not to me. No need to make things uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. The word landed heavy, as if I were the problem simply by existing. I watched his hands as he carved the turkey, steady and practiced, the same hands that used to hold mine in grocery store lines, the same hands that now couldn't be bothered to warn me before cutting me loose in front of an audience. I thought about standing up, about saying something sharp, something that would freeze the room. But I didn't. I stayed. I stayed because leaving would have looked dramatic, and I refused to give them that story to tell later. Instead, I listened. I listened as they planned future holidays without me, as if I were already gone. At one point, his mother turned to me. You'll still come by to pick up your things later, she said. Not a question. We'll pack them up. Make it easier. Easier for who? I wondered. I nodded again. My head felt like it was moving without my permission. The check came before dessert. Mark waved it away. I've got it, he said automatically. Then he paused, looked at me. Unless you want to. It was a test. I could feel it. I reached into my purse with steady hands and pulled out my card. Not because I wanted to prove anything, just because I wanted one small choice that night to be mine. The waitress took it without comment and walked away. The table buzzed again. Elaine leaned toward her husband and whispered something. He smiled. I didn't ask what they said. I didn't need to know. I sat there, breathing slowly, counting the lines in the tablecloth, waiting for the night to end. I didn't know then that something had already shifted. I only knew that the woman I'd been when I walked into that restaurant was gone. And the woman sitting there now was very, very quiet. And sometimes quiet is where everything begins. And sometimes quiet is where everything begins. I sat there for a few seconds after that thought passed through me, staring at the place where the waitress had disappeared before I realized something else was happening. Not around the table. Inside me, it felt like a door opening somewhere I hadn't visited in years. Behind it were memories I'd kept neatly stacked, labeled harmless, ordinary, not worth revisiting. That night, they tipped forward all at once. I thought about the first time Mark dismissed me in public. It was small. So small, I barely noticed it then. We were at a hardware store, maybe 15 years into our marriage. I'd suggested a paint color for the living room. He laughed and told the clerk, "She's got ideas, but I'll handle it." The clerk smiled politely. I smiled too. I told myself it was nothing. Men joke like that. Couples tease. I let it go, but it hadn't stopped there. It never does. Over the years, those moments stacked up like unopened mail. The dinner parties where he answered questions directed at me. the family gatherings where my opinions were brushed aside with a wave of his hand. Phoebe doesn't really keep up with that stuff, he'd say, or she's more of a feelings person. Everyone would nod, as if that explained everything. I remembered how often I adjusted myself to fit that role. Softer voice, shorter sentences, less certainty. It wasn't a conscious choice at first. It was survival. When you realize that speaking up earns you eye rolls and silence earns you peace, you learn quickly which one feels safer. His family helped reinforce it. His mother had a way of correcting me without raising her voice. "Oh no, dear," she'd say, smiling. "That's not how Mark likes it." As if my preferences were a misunderstanding that needed fixing. I learned to ask before changing anything, before inviting anyone, before deciding anything that might ripple beyond the kitchen. And when I did speak up, when I tried to explain how small those moments made me feel, Mark would sigh. Not angry, disappointed. That was worse. "You're too sensitive," he'd say. No one meant anything by it. So I stopped explaining. I stopped asking for space. I told myself marriage was about compromise. I told myself love meant patience. I told myself I was lucky to have stability. Those were all words that sounded reasonable. They were also the words that kept me quiet. As I sat at that Christmas table, watching people talk around me, it finally hit me why the laughter hurt so much. It wasn't just about the divorce. It was about how comfortable they were dismissing me. They weren't crossing a line. They were staying in one. A line I'd helped draw by shrinking myself year after year. I thought about the time Elaine hosted Thanksgiving and asked everyone what they were grateful for. When it was my turn, I said I was grateful for the years Mark and I had built together. She laughed then too. "You always say things like that," she said. "So sweet. Not sincere. Sweet. Like a child reciting something rehearsed." That night, I realized they'd never seen me as a full person, just an extension of Mark. And once he decided he was done, they followed his lead without hesitation. Loyalty wasn't to marriage. It was to hierarchy. The room felt warmer as these thoughts rolled through me. Or maybe I was. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with clarity. I could trace the pattern now. Every time I'd been interrupted, every time my concerns were labeled drama, every time I'd been encouraged to just let it go for the sake of peace. I remembered a conversation from years earlier when Mark took over handling our finances completely. I'd asked questions, not accusations, just questions. He smiled, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Trust me, this stuff stresses you out." I believed him. I handed over responsibility without realizing I was handing over authority too. There were moments I'd almost spoken up again, like when he forgot my birthday and laughed it off as losing track of dates, or when he booked trips without checking if I could take time off from the volunteer work I loved. He'd say, "You're flexible. That's one of your best qualities." Flexibility, another word that sounded like praise until it wasn't. I thought about how often I defended him to friends. "He's just blunt. He means well. He doesn't think before he speaks." I'd said those things so many times they felt true. What I didn't realize was how rarely anyone defended me in return. At the table, his father mentioned a story from years ago about a camping trip Mark took with friends. I wasn't invited. I never was. Phoebe doesn't really like roughing it, Mark had told them. That wasn't true. I loved being outdoors. I loved quiet mornings and cold air, and doing things that felt real. But no one had asked me. They'd accepted his version of me because it was easier. I wondered how many versions of myself I'd allowed to be rewritten. My phone buzzed in my purse. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. Nothing on that screen mattered more than what was happening in my head. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to smooth anything over. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I was just observing, watching the people around me as if from a distance. And what I saw was ordinary cruelty, not shouting, not insults, just comfort with my discomfort. That's what hurt the most. That's what finally made sense. I thought back to the early years when Mark and I first met. He'd been attentive then, curious. He asked questions and listened to the answers. Somewhere along the way, listening became optional, then unnecessary, then inconvenient, and I'd adjusted myself accordingly, like furniture moved to make space for someone else. A memory surfaced of a doctor's appointment years earlier. The doctor had asked me a question, and Mark answered before I could. The doctor looked at me, waited. I smiled and nodded instead of correcting him. I remembered feeling a brief flash of embarrassment, then relief. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to take up space. That relief had a cost. I was paying it now. Across the table, Elaine asked Mark how soon he planned to move. He shrugged. "Soon as I find a place," he said. "I need a fresh start." A fresh start. I almost laughed then. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. He'd been talking about fresh starts for years. New routines, new goals. Somehow, I was never included in those visions. I was part of the present, not the future. I wondered what would have happened if I'd asked for more. If I'd insisted on being heard, would things have been different? Or would the ending have arrived sooner, just with less ceremony? The thought didn't make me sad. It made me calm. For so long, I'd believed the problem was my reaction. That if I could just be less affected, less hurt, less aware, things would smooth out. That night, I finally saw that my reactions were reasonable responses to being dismissed. That clarity was painful, but it was also grounding. It meant I wasn't broken. I was responding to something real. Mark leaned toward his mother and whispered something. She nodded. I didn't strain to hear it. It didn't matter. Whatever they were planning, it no longer included me, and that was okay. More than okay. It was necessary. I thought about the woman I used to be before I learned to make myself small. The one who spoke without checking the room first. The one who laughed loudly and said no when she meant it. I hadn't lost her. I'd just buried her under layers of politeness and patience. The realization didn't arrive with fireworks. It settled in slowly, like dust after something breaks. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't plotting. I was understanding that this moment wasn't sudden. It was the final note in a long song I'd been humming without listening to. When the waitress walked by again, she glanced at me and paused just for a second. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. I met her eyes. "It will be," I said, and for the first time that night, I believed it. The laughter around the table faded into background noise. The years of dismissal lined up neatly in my mind, no longer confusing, no longer personal failures. Just evidence. Evidence that I had been living inside someone else's story for too long. And now, sitting there with my hands folded and my heart steady, I understood something clearly. This wasn't the end of my voice. It was the moment I finally heard it. I watched the waitress walk past my side of the table again, her tray balanced carefully, the silverware rattling lightly against the porcelain plates. She moved with ease, practiced and quiet, yet that brief glance she shot me froze something in the air. It wasn't the smile of politeness we exchange at every restaurant, a polite acknowledgement. No, this was different. Her eyes lingered on my card in a way that suggested recognition, maybe even curiosity. Only I noticed it, and for a split second, it made the room feel smaller, somehow isolating me from the laughter and chatter surrounding me. I could feel the tension in my shoulders shift slightly, my body responding before my mind did. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew that something had passed between us in that moment, something quiet, almost invisible to everyone else at the table, yet monumental for me. That glance told me that, in some way, the world outside of my husband's orchestrated humiliation still saw me, that I wasn't completely invisible. That recognition alone, that pause, felt like the tiniest spark of a life I had almost forgotten I deserved. I put my hand back on the folded napkin in front of me, gripping the edges as though it could anchor me. The sound of someone laughing too, loudly, a few chairs over-threatened to drown out the weight of the moment, but I focused silently on the pause. Her hesitation, that split second she held before taking the card, carried a gravity I could not yet explain. The world seemed to stretch for just a heartbeat, a fraction of time that lingered like mist. I noticed the way her eyebrows subtly rose, the tilt of her head, the ever-so-slight pause of her hand above the card. It was deliberate, considered. She wasn't just processing a payment. She was processing me. I wondered what she saw. Was it the name on the card, my signature, or something else? Some unspoken detail that made her stop and look closer? I thought about how few people had ever actually looked at me, really looked, and realized I could count them on one hand. And in that moment, with the soft hum of the restaurant and the muted clinking of glasses, I felt a pang of gratitude for the smallest acknowledgement. My mind drifted back to smaller incidents over the years, moments I had long forgotten. Times when I'd noticed glances from strangers that seemed curious or kind or quietly approving, tiny affirmations I'd barely registered because I'd spent so much time disappearing for the comfort of others. I remembered walking through grocery store aisles where a cashier had smiled knowingly as I paid, as if silently saying, "I see you, and you belong." None of it compared to the weight of this one glance tonight, at this precise moment. It was concentrated, focused, significant. The difference was palpable, and I realized just how starved I had been for that recognition in my own life. Mark was talking to his sister now, gesturing casually with his fork. His words blurred as my attention returned to the waiter, who now held my card between her fingers for just a few more seconds than necessary. I noticed the subtle way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the slight narrowing of her eyes. She was looking, analyzing, seeing, and it struck me that perhaps she understood more than anyone at this table, more than Mark, more than Elaine, more than the smug family who thought they had already written the end of my story. The tension in my chest grew, but in a different way than before. Before, tension had been constriction, fear, humiliation. Now, it felt like anticipation. The kind of anticipation that is not loud or dramatic, but quietly electric. I could feel it crawling along my nerves, whispering that tonight, despite everything, the rules had subtly shifted. Something invisible, almost impossible to define, had been set in motion. And it had nothing to do with Mark, or his family, or even me, really. It was out there, in that small, deliberate pause. I tried not to make it obvious, but my gaze lingered on the waitress as she moved toward the manager's station. Her hands were steady, her pace composed, yet the weight behind her brief pause stayed with me, pressing against the corners of my mind like a secret waiting to be revealed. No one else seemed to notice, not even Mark. They were too busy congratulating themselves on the public drama they thought they'd orchestrated perfectly. That was their mistake. Only I understood the undercurrent that had begun. A flash of doubt entered my mind. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was projecting significance where there was none. But the tightness in my stomach, the flush creeping across my cheeks, told me otherwise. Recognition. even when silent, leaves a mark. Even the smallest acknowledgement can stir something inside a person who has been overlooked, dismissed, minimized, or erased for years. I remember times I had been overlooked in other spaces, the volunteer committee I attended, where ideas I brought up were nodded at but rarely acted upon, the neighborhood book club, where opinions were acknowledged with polite murmurs but then dismissed, the workplace I left long ago, where promotions passed me by even when I was quietly the most competent person in the room. Each instance had felt small, insignificant, invisible. Each had taught me that recognition often came quietly or not at all. And yet here it was delivered in a single weighty pause from a stranger who didn't owe me anything. That pause felt like reclamation. I shifted slightly in my chair, careful not to make the movement seem intentional. The faint scrape of the fork against my plate punctuated the silence around my seat. My heart thumped in a rhythm that was half fear, half curiosity, half something entirely new. The years of being dismissed, of shrinking, of letting my voice be ignored, all seemed to converge in that small moment. It was as though the universe or fate or simply life itself had chosen this precise pause to offer me a sliver of acknowledgement that had been long overdue. Mark's voice, once sharp and commanding, faded into background noise. Elaine leaned toward him to whisper something again, probably another jab, thinly veiled as concern, but I barely registered it. My focus was on the card, the hands holding it, the deliberate, almost reverent care with which the waitress seemed to examine it. And I realized then that perhaps this moment was a test, not of me, but of them. They couldn't see it yet, couldn't understand what was happening outside their bubble of smug satisfaction. But I could. My thoughts wandered to the years I had spent quietly watching other people navigate their victories, while I felt invisible. The smallest gestures, someone meeting my gaze, nodding knowingly, pausing, had often carried more weight than years of verbal validation ever could. I felt a profound connection to that moment. And for a brief second, a flicker of hope emerged. Recognition, even without explanation, even without applause, had the power to shift perspective. It reminded me that the world had more dimensions than the tiny box Mark and his family had tried to contain me in. I could feel it then, the subtle change in the air around me. The energy shifted imperceptibly, a current moving beneath the surface of polite chatter. It was almost like holding a note in a song, a note that resonates long after the music ends. Something unspoken was taking shape, and I was part of it, whether anyone else at the table realized it or not. That pause, that careful attention, had opened a door I hadn't even known existed, and I could feel it swinging slowly on its hinges. The waiter's pause wasn't about the card or about money or about the restaurant protocol. It was about truth, and truth has a way of making itself known, even in the smallest, quietest moments. I watched her walk away, disappearing behind the partition near the kitchen, and felt an odd sense of alignment, as though something had been set in motion, invisible but undeniable, that might never fully reveal itself to anyone else at the table. But I had seen it, I had felt it, and that was enough. I let my gaze drift around the room briefly, catching Mark mid-gesture, Elaine smirking at some imagined joke, and his mother nodding in quiet approval. They were still in their little performance, still believing the night belonged entirely to them. But I knew differently now. A single pause, unnoticed by everyone else, had altered the balance in ways they could never predict. I could almost feel their arrogance begin to crack, tiny fissures forming beneath the polished surface of their certainty. I returned my attention to the table setting, noticing details I had ignored before. The faint scuff on the corner of the wooden table, the way the candlelight flickered against the glasses, the subtle scent of rosemary from the turkey centerpiece. Each sensory detail seemed sharper, more vivid, more alive than it had before. as if the pause had awakened me to a reality I had long been blind to, one in which I mattered, even when everyone else tried to convince me I did not. I reflected on how easily the years of invisibility had taught me to accept being overlooked. How many times had I smiled, nodded, and allowed conversations to move on without my input because it was easier than challenging the silence? How many moments had I lost, believing that my voice wasn't important? And yet here in a small, ordinary restaurant, a simple, human pause reminded me that recognition could arrive from the most unexpected places, at the most ordinary times. A flicker of determination ran through me. Quiet, steady, unshakable. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it felt like the beginning of reclaiming something I hadn't known I'd lost. I realized I had spent decades letting others define me, defining who I was, what I wanted, what I deserved. But no longer. That pause was a quiet signal that the world had noticed me, and maybe, just maybe, it was time I noticed myself again. And so I sat there, my fingers curling gently around the napkin, feeling an odd sense of patience and anticipation. The pause had done more than shift my perception. It had reminded me that even when you are minimized, dismissed, or ignored, recognition can come in ways that don't require shouting, confrontation, or spectacle. Sometimes it comes in a small, deliberate moment of attention, the kind that quietly changes the rhythm of a room without anyone else realizing it. For the first time that night, I felt fully present, not invisible, not irrelevant, not dismissed, just seen. And I understood that this small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, the kind no one else noticed but me, was the first sign that my story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I watched the waitress disappear toward the back of the restaurant, leaving me with the faintest sense of expectation lingering in the air. It was subtle, like the calm before a storm, but I could feel it pressing against the edges of the night. For the first time that evening, I realized that recognition didn't have to be loud to matter. Some truths have a quiet way of making themselves known, slipping into the world without fanfare. And tonight, it seemed the universe was beginning to tip in my favor. The minutes passed with a strange elasticity. The room continued its usual hum of holiday chatter, the clinking of glasses, the subtle scrape of utensils, yet something invisible had shifted. My husband's laughter, once cutting, now felt hollow. His in-laws continued their polite mockery, unaware of the subtle undercurrent forming beneath the surface. I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm wash over me, a sense that the next moment might bring clarity, not confrontation, not spectacle, just undeniable truth finally asserting itself. I remember the exact instant it happened. The waitress returned, her steps measured, but there was a certainty in the way she approached. In her hands was my card, now accompanied by a small slip of paper I hadn't expected. She placed it in front of me carefully, as though it were fragile, and met my gaze with a look that seemed to weigh more than any spoken word. I felt the familiar tension in my shoulders tighten first, followed by an almost imperceptible thrill of anticipation. Something was about to happen, and it didn't need anyone else to announce it. "What's this?" I asked softly, lifting the slip of paper without drawing attention. She smiled, just slightly, a hint of reassurance. "It's information for you, ma'am. You'll want to see this." I glanced down at the note. My eyes caught the name immediately, a legal case I had been involved in years ago, one that my husband had quietly attempted to erase from the record in his own favor. I remember the cold pit forming in my stomach, the same one I'd felt when he first decided to dismiss me, entirely the same one that had followed me through the years of being minimized. But this time, it was different. This time, the proof was tangible. Quietly tangible. I traced the letters with my finger, the words registering slowly as if my mind needed to absorb each one separately. He had tried to claim the settlement as part of a joint account, a fiction he had created to erase my stake without raising any alarms. The bank records, the legal papers, the documentation that could expose his deception. It had all been quietly preserved, and now a stranger, a waitress I had never met before, had delivered it without a hint of judgment, without fanfare, without spectacle. Just proof. I felt my pulse quicken. The calm I had carried only moments ago shifted into something sharper, more focused. For years, I had been dismissed, belittled, told that my voice and presence didn't matter. I had been patient, careful, shrinking myself to fit the version of life others wanted me to inhabit. And yet here was something that could not be ignored, no matter how much Mark and his family tried to pretend it didn't exist. It was as if the universe had finally chosen to place the scales back into balance. And this moment, the simple, quiet act of a waitress pausing to hand me the evidence, was the instrument. I carefully unfolded the paperwork, scanning each line, confirming what I already suspected. The settlement funds had never been fully transferred. The legal instructions were precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Every date, every signature, every notarized mark aligned perfectly with what should have been mine. I felt a strange thrill of vindication, not the kind that demands shouting or confrontation, but the kind that settles quietly in your chest, a warmth spreading from your heart down to your fingertips. It was a subtle, silent power. I glanced up at the table. Mark was still smiling, still gesturing, still performing the role of husband who believed he had orchestrated the perfect humiliation. His in-laws were oblivious, heads nodding, small jokes exchanged. They could not see what I held in my hand. They could not hear the whisper of justice that had arrived silently at my side. And that was perfect. The proof didn't need to be announced. It didn't need their acknowledgement. It existed undeniable, absolute, a fact they could not rewrite, no matter how loudly they laughed. The sensation of quiet satisfaction was intoxicating. I realized that for years I had equated power with volume. The louder someone shouted, the more control they seemed to wield. But here was proof that true power could arrive softly, without noise, without drawing attention to itself. And yet, its impact was far greater than anything Mark or his family could conjure with their carefully curated performance. I folded the paper slowly and tucked it back into my purse, careful not to make a show of it. The waitress had returned to her station, moving with the same quiet professionalism, unaware of the storm she had just helped ignite. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight in my chest lighten slightly. I had evidence that would allow me to reclaim control of a situation that had been unfairly manipulated for years. And then the most surprising part happened. The tension I had carried in my chest began to transform into clarity. I realized that all those years of being dismissed, ignored, and minimized had prepared me for this moment. I was not unprepared or weak. I was patient. I was observant. I had learned to notice the subtle shifts, the tiny pauses, the quiet gestures. I had learned to listen when others spoke and to hear even the things left unsaid. And now, that skill, honed over decades of navigating dismissal, was paying off. I caught Mark's eye briefly across the table. There was no recognition in his glance, only a smug confidence that he still believed he was in control. Elaine leaned in, whispering something about a party next week, and his mother nodded approvingly. None of them could guess the gravity of the moment I had just experienced. They could not see that their careful orchestration of humiliation had been quietly undermined by a single pause, a single acknowledgement, and a slip of paper delivered without ceremony. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the proof rest against my chest, feeling it press lightly against the fabric of my sweater. It was heavy in a comforting way. The years of being overlooked had left me hungry for recognition, and now it had arrived in the form of undeniable truth. I felt a wave of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Hope. Not the naive, fleeting hope of a storybook ending, but a grounded, realistic hope that comes from knowing that justice can arrive quietly without fanfare and still be absolute. I remembered other moments of quiet revelation in my life. The night my college advisor praised my work when I thought no one had noticed, the day a neighbor quietly returned a lost wallet with a note acknowledging my honesty, the time a stranger complimented my garden in a way that felt genuinely seeing rather than casual. Each of those instances had been small, almost imperceptible, yet they had stayed with me, accumulated, building an understanding that sometimes the loudest events do not carry the most weight. And tonight, that lesson manifested in full force. The waitress returned one last time to clear the table, her movements deliberate and calm. She didn't say a word about the papers. She didn't need to. The shift had already occurred. Proof had done its work silently, efficiently, irrevocably. I realized then that the moment was as much about preparation as it was about revelation. I had been ready for this, even without knowing it. The years of quiet endurance, the decades of observing without confrontation had positioned me to recognize and seize this subtle intervention immediately. As she walked away for the final time, I took stock of my surroundings. The restaurant hummed with warmth, laughter, and holiday chatter. Yet beneath it, there was a layer of tension I alone could perceive. The invisible weight of my knowledge had changed the room, even if no one else could see it. I could feel it in the micro-expressions, the slight shifts in posture, the tiny pauses that had always eluded my notice until now. The world had tilted imperceptibly, and I was the first to notice. I folded the slip of paper once more and placed it back into my purse, close to my heart. I realized that confrontation was unnecessary. Proof, in its quiet, undeniable form, had already spoken. It didn't require dramatics, arguments, or spectacle. It had arrived with precision at the right time, in the right place, in a form that could not be disputed or dismissed. And that realization, that understanding of the subtle but absolute power of truth, filled me with a calm determination I had not felt in years. For the first time in decades, I felt in control, not because I had raised my voice or forced recognition, but because the facts were undeniable, and I alone had the clarity to see them. I could navigate the rest of the night, the family, and the conversations ahead with this invisible advantage, silently holding power that could not be stripped away. It was proof that one doesn't always need to fight loudly to be heard. Sometimes it's the quiet moments, the pauses, the deliberate gestures, and the undeniable facts that hold the most weight. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the truth settle around me, like a cloak. The room continued its performance, oblivious to the quiet force now at play. I realized, finally, that strength could be soft, subtle, and unseen, yet more enduring than any raised voice. Proof had surfaced without raising its own voice, and in doing so, it had shifted everything. And for the first time that night, I felt a profound sense of readiness for whatever came next, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with quiet, undeniable authority. I sat for a long moment, the slip of paper tucked carefully in my purse, my fingers still brushing the soft leather, as if the proof itself had weight and warmth. The laughter, the forced cheer, the smug satisfaction of Mark and his family, it all continued around me, oblivious to the quiet storm that had just taken root. And for the first time that night, I realized that I didn't need to make a scene. I didn't need dramatic words, tears, or angry confrontations. I had what I needed: clarity, dignity, and proof. And with that, I could leave without applause, without acknowledgement, and still emerge intact, stronger than I had been in years. I stood slowly, feeling the subtle tension in the room shift in a way no one else could detect. Mark looked at me briefly, a half smile, a flicker of expectation, as if I would finally react like he thought I should. But I didn't. I met his gaze evenly, a calm certainty in my eyes that startled even me. No words left my mouth. I simply gathered my purse, smoothed my sweater, and turned toward the exit. Every step toward the door felt deliberate, as if I were reclaiming a piece of myself with each one. The room seemed to stretch out as I moved. I could feel every small murmur, every subtle shift in posture as they processed my silence. But I ignored them. I didn't need their reactions. I didn't need their validation. I had learned over the years that applause and recognition are often less meaningful than quiet self-assurance. And tonight, I carried that with me. My heart was steady. My chest felt open, unburdened for the first time in decades. I remembered the times I had wanted to walk away before, the holidays when I had forced myself to smile, the vacations where I had suppressed my own preferences, the dinner conversations where I had swallowed words that might have sparked disagreement. Every instance had been a rehearsal for this moment, training me to leave without needing approval, to claim my life quietly, confidently. And now it was happening, not as a reaction to humiliation, but as a conscious choice to honor myself. I reached the door and felt the cool air from outside brush against my cheeks. The city had that faint smell of winter and pine, a mixture of crisp cold and faint exhaust that somehow felt familiar, comforting even. I stepped out and felt my body release tension I hadn't realized I had carried, the weight of years of dismissal, of being minimized, of existing quietly while others assumed control, began to lift with every step across the sidewalk. I felt my life stretching in front of me, unclaimed but entirely mine for the first time in decades. A passerby smiled at me, small and kind, and I realized I returned it without hesitation. That simple acknowledgement, brief and human, felt like an affirmation of all the tiny victories I had overlooked in myself for years. The streetlights glowed softly against the snow-dusted sidewalks, reflecting in the windows of small shops that had long gone unnoticed. I noticed things now, the detail in a shop sign, the pattern of frost on a lamppost, the quiet rhythm of people walking to their destinations. It was all vivid, all part of a world that I had never fully seen while trapped in the invisible box Mark and his family had constructed for me. I stopped for a moment, resting my hands lightly on the straps of my purse, feeling the slip of paper against my hip. It was a small thing, yet it represented everything. Not vengeance, not spectacle, not validation, just truth. Quiet, undeniable truth. And I understood that walking away with that truth was far more powerful than any dramatic confrontation could ever have been. I didn't need applause or acknowledgement. I only needed myself, and that was finally enough. I thought about how this moment would look from the outside. People might see a woman leaving a restaurant quietly after a humiliating announcement. They might not know about the pause, the slip of paper, the proof waiting quietly in her purse. But that was irrelevant. What mattered was the internal landscape I was navigating, a terrain of dignity, clarity, and empowerment that no one else could touch. I had reclaimed myself, silently, deliberately, and without fanfare. As I walked down the street, the sounds of the city wrapped around me. Distant traffic, the soft crunch of snow beneath shoes, the occasional muffled laughter from someone walking with friends. Each sound felt sharper, more immediate. The world no longer blurred into the background. I was noticing again, fully alive, fully present, fully myself. And I realized that this presence, this awareness was my true reward. Proof, recognition, and the simple act of walking away were inseparable from the feeling of life returned to me. I passed a small cafe, the kind with frosted windows, and the faint smell of cinnamon and brewed coffee drifting through the cracked open door. A mother held her child, and the child waved at me, smiling without hesitation. I smiled back. There was no need for explanation, no need for recognition, just the quiet understanding that even small gestures of acknowledgement carried weight. That, I realized, had been missing from my life for decades. I hadn't needed grand declarations. I had needed recognition that I existed, that I mattered, even in subtle, everyday ways. The winter air was biting now, and I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it didn't diminish the warmth building in my chest, the years of invisibility, the countless times my voice was ignored, the years of walking carefully through spaces that weren't designed to notice me. All of it had led to this moment of quiet, unshakable strength. I didn't need Mark's validation. I didn't need his family's acknowledgement. I had proof. I had perspective. I had myself. I thought about the years ahead. They were uncharted, uncertain, and entirely my own. I could plan, decide, move, and speak without anyone else's interference. The freedom was almost dizzying in its scope, yet it grounded me, rooted me in a way that nothing else ever had. I realized that the best revenge, if you could call it that, was simply living fully, authentically, and unapologetically, not to spite anyone, but to honor yourself. I paused on the corner, looking back briefly at the restaurant, the familiar glow of its lights warming the snow-covered street. Inside, I imagined Mark sitting with his family, unaware that the balance had quietly shifted. They thought they had orchestrated the evening perfectly, but proof doesn't need dramatics. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need witnesses. And now I understood that. I smiled to myself, small and private, feeling the calm satisfaction of someone who finally understands her own strength. The city stretched before me, full of people going about their lives, each absorbed in their own stories. I was no longer a minor character in someone else's narrative. I was the protagonist of my own. I could step into every corner of the city, every path, every street, knowing that I carried with me both proof and perspective, and that neither could be taken from me. The weight of humiliation, years of dismissal, and emotional erasure had been transformed into clarity, quiet strength, and freedom. I reached my car, parked under the faint glow of a streetlight, and paused again before opening the door. I thought about how many times I had wanted to drive away from situations where I was minimized, belittled, or dismissed. Tonight, I did it differently. Tonight, I left not as a reaction, but as a conscious choice. I left with my life intact, my dignity intact, my proof intact. And that made all the difference. Sliding into the driver's seat, I took a deep breath. The engine started with a soft purr, and I felt the vibration beneath me as though it were synchronizing with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt awareness, purpose, and a quiet triumph. I was going somewhere, yes, but more importantly, I was moving forward within myself in ways I hadn't been allowed to for decades. Driving through the streets now, lights reflecting off wet asphalt, I let my mind wander, not to anger or revenge, but to possibility. I thought about the future, a future in which I could choose my own companions, my own spaces, my own path. I could reclaim experiences that had been denied to me, invest in interests that had been minimized, and live in ways that had always been quietly stifled. And all of it began with walking away that night, silently, without a word, without applause, but fully alive. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who has emerged from years of confinement, recognition, and dismissal, and finally stepped fully into her own life. The house was silent, empty, but welcoming, a place where I could exhale completely free from judgment or expectation. I placed the slip of paper on the kitchen counter, a tangible reminder that truth, patience, and quiet attention had restored a measure of justice. I did not need applause to validate it. I had internalized it fully. Sitting by the window later that night, looking at the faint glow of streetlights reflecting on snow, I realized that life could be rebuilt in increments, silently, intentionally, without the need for dramatics. The lesson was simple but profound. Walking away with your life intact is sometimes the strongest, most lasting victory you can achieve. And for the first time in decades, I felt it entirely safe, seen, and finally in control of my own story. As I sat by the window that night, the world outside quiet beneath a soft layer of snow, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not the pain, not the betrayal, not the humiliation. It had all passed, left behind at that restaurant table like yesterday's news. What remained was far more profound: clarity, self-respect, and a sense of life reclaimed. I realized with a steady, calming certainty that for years I had been living in fragments, defined by the expectations, dismissals, and judgments of others. Every laugh that had cut me, every overlooked comment, every subtle gesture that made me feel small, all of it had shaped a version of me that existed for their comfort, their control. And now, for the first time, that version of me no longer had any power over my life. I was whole. I was present. I was finally, unapologetically myself. The slip of paper, the quiet pause of the waitress, the unnoticed proof. It wasn't just about money or justice or even the humiliation Mark had orchestrated. It was a reminder that recognition and truth often arrive without drama, without spectacle, without the audience you expect. They arrive quietly, sometimes from strangers, sometimes from circumstances beyond your control, and they carry with them a power that no amount of arrogance or cruelty can erase. And as I held that knowledge in my heart, I realized that my life had shifted in a way that Mark and his family could never anticipate. They had tried to write the final chapter, to control the story, but truth had a way of surfacing, and it did so without raising its voice. I thought of all the years I had spent shrinking, softening my edges, and silencing my own voice to make room for others. Every small act of self-denial, every concession to their comfort, every time I had hidden a part of myself, had been a preparation I hadn't recognized. Because now, when I walked away, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't for anyone's approval or applause. I carried proof, dignity, and the knowledge that my life, my choices, my voice, all of it was finally intact, and that mattered more than anything else in the world. I felt a quiet joy, the kind that doesn't shout or demand attention, but fills every corner of your being with warmth and certainty. I smiled to myself, feeling a kind of peace I had long believed was unreachable. The city outside continued its usual rhythm, unaware of the small yet monumental victory that had quietly taken place in a corner of its glow. And as I closed my eyes and let the night embrace me, I realized something I had almost forgotten in all those years of dismissal: that life can be reclaimed, that respect can be earned quietly, and that walking away, without anger, without spectacle, but fully aware of your worth, is the strongest, most enduring form of triumph a person can achieve. I opened my eyes again, looking at the soft glow of the streetlights reflected on the snow, and whispered to myself, I am free. I am whole. I am enough. And for the first time in decades, I truly believed it.